Stephen Colbert thought he had the perfect trap set. The Late Show's cameras were rolling. The audience was prime for their nightly dose of political mockery. And sitting across from him was White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, young, sharp, and according to Colbert's writers, the perfect target for comedic destruction. What happened next wasn't just television history. It was the moment late-night comedy died on live TV. If you're here for the truth they tried to bury, hit that like button, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and subscribe, because this is the moment that changed everything. The Ed Sullivan Theater buzzed with its usual pre-show energy. Audience members shuffled into their seats, phones tucked away, ready for another night of Stephen Colbert's signature blend of smug superiority and carefully crafted Trump jokes. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the bookers had landed a big fish. Karoline Leavitt, at just 27 years old, had become the youngest White House press secretary in American history. Sharp-tongued, unflappable, and devastatingly effective at dismantling hostile media narratives, she was exactly the kind of guest Colbert's team believed they could break down for easy laughs. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Jake Paul was also scheduled to appear that night. The YouTube star turned boxer was supposed to do a light segment about his upcoming fight, a throwaway interview to fill time after the main event. He sat in the green room, scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing at the monitors showing Colbert's opening monologue. The studio audience laughed on cue as Colbert delivered his usual barrage of political one-liners. The White House announced today that they're sending their press secretary to explain their latest policy disasters, he quipped, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain. Which is like sending a kindergartner to explain quantum physics. Karoline Leavitt walked onto the stage with the kind of confidence that comes from facing down the White House press corps daily. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer that photographed perfectly under the studio lights, she waved to the audience with a smile that never wavered, even as some attendees offered only polite, hesitant applause. Colbert rose from behind his desk, arms spread wide in exaggerated welcome. Karoline Leavitt, everybody, the woman brave enough to defend the indefensible on a daily basis. The audience chuckled, and Colbert's grin widened like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "Thanks for having me, Stephen," Karoline replied, settling into the guest chair with practiced ease. Her voice carried that slight New Hampshire accent that had become familiar to millions of Americans, but there was steel underneath the politeness. "Oh, the pleasure is all mine," Colbert said, his eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. "I have to ask, and forgive me if this sounds rude, but I'm curious. How does it feel to be the youngest person ever hold your position? Like, do you ever wake up and think, maybe I should have gotten a real job first?" The question was designed to draw blood from the start. Instead of rattling her, Karoline tilted her head slightly, as if considering the inquiry with genuine thoughtfulness. "You know, Stephen, I think experience isn't always about age. It's about preparation, principle, and the ability to communicate clearly under pressure. I've been doing that my whole career." "Your whole career?" Colbert repeated mockingly, making air quotes. "Which started when exactly? Your senior year of high school? I mean, let's be honest here. You're basically a political intern with a fancy title." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Even by late-night standards, the hostility was unusually naked and personal. But Karoline didn't flinch. "I started in politics at 17, actually. Worked on campaigns, handled communications for multiple offices, served as the youngest communications director in New Hampshire history. So while some people were making jokes for a living, I was learning how to govern." The subtle dig landed perfectly. Colbert's smile turned sharp and ugly. "Right, governing. Let's talk about that. Your boss has been in office for just a few weeks and already he's managed to make more enemies than a dictator. How do you sleep at night defending policies that even kindergartners would find morally questionable?" "Actually, Stephen, if you want to talk numbers instead of insults, let's talk about them accurately," Karoline replied, reaching into her jacket and pulling out a small note card. "The latest polling shows a 7-point increase in economic confidence, a 12-point jump in border security approval, and the highest consumer optimism in 3 years. But I understand facts don't make for good comedy." Colbert's jaw tightened visibly. This wasn't going according to script. His writers had prepared him for deflection, for talking points, for the usual political non-answers. They hadn't prepared him for someone who came armed with receipts and refused to be intimidated. Meanwhile, in the green room, Jake Paul had stopped scrolling through his phone. The monitor showed Colbert looking increasingly frustrated and mean-spirited as Karoline methodically dismantled his attacks. Jake had seen enough media hit jobs to recognize one in progress, and something about the dynamic on screen was starting to seriously piss him off. Back in the studio, Colbert was dropping his comedic mask entirely. "Look, sweetheart," he said, the condescension dripping from every word. "I appreciate the confidence, but let's be honest about what we're seeing. You're a pretty face, reading from a script, defending a man who treats the Constitution like toilet paper." That's an interesting perspective from someone whose entire career is built on reading jokes other people write for him, Karoline replied evenly. "But let's talk about actual journalism. You've been hosting this show for how long now? 8 years? And in that time, how many times have you had a conservative guest on without making them the punchline? How many times have you presented both sides of an issue without turning it into a character assassination?" The audience grew deadly quiet. This wasn't the usual back and forth they were used to. This was a press secretary treating Colbert like he was at a press briefing, and it was uncomfortable to watch. Colbert leaned back in his chair, his persona shifting from playful to openly vicious. "You know what I think, little girl? I think you're confusing having a big title with actually being qualified for it. My job is to make people laugh at the absurdity of American politics, especially when that absurdity is represented by children pretending to be adults." The words "little girl" hung in the air like poison. Several audience members audibly gasped. Even Colbert's most loyal fans recognized that he had crossed a line. "Little girl," Karoline repeated slowly, her voice remaining steady despite the obvious insult. "That's interesting. So you've appointed yourself not just the moral arbiter of American political discourse, but also the judge of who deserves respect based on their age and gender. That's quite a responsibility for someone whose main qualification is making people chuckle at scripted jokes." The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even the crew members behind the cameras had stopped their usual bustling. This had moved beyond political disagreement into genuinely ugly territory. Colbert's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. The "little girl" comment had been a mistake, and he knew it. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You know what? You're right. Let me be more specific. You're exactly what's wrong with this generation. Entitled, inexperienced brats who think having a college degree and a political connection gives them the right to lecture their betters." "Their betters?" Karoline's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that what you consider yourself, Stephen? Better than the people you're supposed to be informing? Better than some privileged princess who got her job because she looks good on camera and can regurgitate talking points without crying? Yeah, absolutely." Colbert's voice was rising now, his carefully constructed TV personality completely abandoned. "I've been in this business longer than you've been out of diapers. I've interviewed presidents, covered wars, won Emmy Awards. What have you done except show up and look pretty?" The audience was now visibly uncomfortable. Some were looking toward the exits. Others were filming with their phones despite the no recording policy. Everyone understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and ugly. Meanwhile, in the green room, Jake Paul had seen enough. He stood up from the couch where he'd been watching the character assassination unfold. A production assistant tried to stop him. He wasn't supposed to go on for another 20 minutes, but Jake was already moving toward the stage entrance. "Hey, you can't go out there yet," the assistant protested, grabbing Jake's arm. Jake shook him off. "Watch me." Back in the studio, Colbert was building toward his nastiest attack yet. "You want to know what I really think?" he said, leaning forward with genuine malice in his eyes. "I think you're a perfect example of everything wrong with modern politics. A pretty face with an empty head, promoted way beyond your capabilities, representing an administration that treats women like decorative objects. You're not a press secretary. You're a spokesperson Barbie doll." The words hit the studio like a slap. Several audience members actually stood up, clearly disgusted by what they were witnessing. Karoline's composure wavered for just a moment. Not from hurt, but from sheer disbelief that a supposedly professional interviewer would say something so openly sexist on national television. And that's when Jake Paul burst through the studio doors. "Enough!" His voice cut through the studio like a knife. Every head turned as the YouTube star strode onto the set, his face dark with anger. "What the hell is wrong with you, man?" Colbert looked up, genuinely startled. "Jake? You're not supposed to be—" "Nah, screw that," Jake said, pulling up a chair and positioning it directly between Colbert and Karoline. "I was back there watching this garbage, and I'm not sitting through another second of it." The control room exploded into chaos. Producers were screaming into headsets, trying to figure out what to do. The director was frantically signaling to cut to commercial, but the cameras kept rolling. This was live television, spiraling completely out of control. "This is my show," Colbert said weakly, but even he seemed to realize how pathetic it sounded after what he'd just said to his guest. "Your show?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. "Bro, you just called this woman a Barbie doll on national television. You just spent 10 minutes trying to humiliate someone for doing her job. That's not a show, that's a character assassination disguised as entertainment." Jake turned to look directly into the main camera, ignoring the frantic signals from the production crew. "Everyone watching this needs to understand what just happened here. This isn't comedy, this isn't journalism. This is a grown man having a public meltdown because a young woman made him look stupid with actual facts." Colbert's face went from red to pale. "Jake, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Jake cut him off, turning back to face the host. "You brought her on here thinking you could embarrass her for cheap laughs, and when she turned out to be smarter and more prepared than you expected, you got personal. You got nasty. You called her a little girl and a Barbie doll because you couldn't handle being outclassed." The studio audience was completely silent now, watching this unprecedented confrontation unfold. In the control room, executives were screaming at each other. The show's publicists were already fielding angry calls. But the cameras kept rolling because nobody knew what else to do. "Look," Jake continued, his voice deadly serious, "I don't care about politics. I don't care about Republican or Democrat or whatever. But I care about basic human decency. And what you just did to this woman was indecent. It was sexist. It was unprofessional. And it was cruel." "I was just doing my job," Colbert protested weakly. "Your job?" Jake's voice rose incredulously. "Your job is to call successful women Barbie dolls? Your job is to tell someone they're not qualified for their position because of their age? Your job is to humiliate guests who come on here in good faith?" He stood up from his chair and looked around the studio. "Everyone here just watched a supposedly professional journalist have a public tantrum because his guest was too smart for his prepared insults. And not one person stopped him." That's when the control room finally acted. The on-air light went dark, and the monitors throughout the studio flashed "technical difficulties. Please stand by." The director had cut the live feed, but not before millions of viewers had witnessed the complete meltdown. "What just happened?" Colbert asked, looking around confused as crew members rushed onto the stage. "You got exposed," Jake said simply. "Live on television. And now they're trying to cover it up." Chaos erupted in the studio. Producers surrounded Jake Paul, trying to get him to leave. Others huddled around Colbert, who looked shell-shocked. Security appeared from nowhere, though they seemed unsure of what exactly they were supposed to be securing. Karoline Leavitt stood up calmly, smoothed her blazer, and walked toward the exit. As she passed Jake, she paused. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, I did," Jake replied. "Someone had to." Within minutes, social media exploded. The live feed had been cut, but hundreds of audience members had been filming with their phones. Clips of Jake Paul's intervention were hitting Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram faster than the network's damage control team could react. Hashtag #JakePaulSavesTV began trending immediately. Hashtag #ColbertMeltdown followed close behind. The hashtag #BarbieGate started picking up steam as people focused on the most obviously offensive moment of the interview. The Late Show's social media team went into overdrive, trying to delete and suppress the clips, but it was too late. The internet had already captured everything. When the show returned from its technical difficulties, Colbert was alone at his desk, announcing that they were moving to a pre-taped segment due to unexpected scheduling changes. There was no mention of what had happened, no acknowledgement of the chaos, no apology for the offensive comments, just a desperate attempt to pretend that the previous 15 minutes had never occurred. But the internet doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. By morning, Jake Paul's defense of Karoline Leavitt was the top story on every major news website. Conservative outlets hailed it as proof that even non-political celebrities were tired of media bias and sexism. Liberal outlets tried to downplay it, but the video evidence spoke for itself. Most tellingly, young people across the political spectrum were sharing the clips with comments like, "Finally, someone called this out," and "This is why we don't trust traditional media." Generation Z had found an unlikely hero in Jake Paul, not because of his politics, but because of his willingness to call out obvious injustice. The network's damage control efforts only made things worse. Their attempts to suppress the clips led to accusations of censorship. Their refusal to acknowledge what had happened led to speculation about what else they might be hiding. Within 48 hours, the incident had become a perfect example of everything wrong with mainstream media. CBS released a brief statement saying that The Late Show maintains high standards of professional discourse, but notably did not apologize for Colbert's comments or explain why the feed had been cut during Jake Paul's intervention. 3 days later, Jake Paul posted a video to his YouTube channel titled, "Why I Had to Crash the Late Show." In it, he explained that he had no intention of getting involved in politics, but he couldn't sit by and watch what he saw as bullying and sexism disguised as entertainment. "I don't care if you agree with Karoline Leavitt's politics or not," he said directly to the camera. "What I care about is that she was treated with basic human respect, and she wasn't. A grown man called her a little girl and a Barbie doll on national television because she was better at her job than he expected." The video garnered 25 million views in its first week, introducing Jake Paul's massive young audience to concepts of media bias, sexism in journalism, and the importance of standing up for others, even when it's uncomfortable. Comments from young viewers revealed a growing skepticism of establishment media that transcended political lines. "I never paid attention to politics before," wrote one commenter. "But this made me realize how fake and biased these shows really are. Jake Paul did what none of these professional journalists would do. He told the truth." Karoline Leavitt, for her part, used the momentum to launch a series of media appearances where she continued to demonstrate the same composure and preparation that had served her so well that night.
She never directly commented on Jake Paul's intervention during interviews, but she did post a simple message on social media. "Grateful for those who stand up for what's right, even when it's not their fight." The post was shared millions of times, cementing her status as someone who could handle unfair treatment with grace, while still appreciating those who defended her.
As for Stephen Colbert, The Late Show returned to its usual format of political jokes and celebrity interviews, but something fundamental had changed. The aura of moral authority that late-night hosts had enjoyed for decades had been shattered by a YouTube star who simply refused to pretend that sexist behavior was acceptable. Colbert never apologized for his comments. In fact, he never acknowledged them at all. But the clips lived forever on the internet, and they became required viewing for anyone studying media bias, sexism in journalism, or the power of social media to expose institutional failures. The incident became a case study in multiple university journalism programs. Students analyzed how quickly a scripted entertainment show could spiral into genuine ugliness when a host lost control. They studied how social media had made it impossible for networks to control narratives the way they once could. Most importantly, they examined how someone with no journalistic training had managed to restore basic decency to a situation where the supposed professional had abandoned it entirely. Media critics were forced to grapple with uncomfortable questions. If Jake Paul, a YouTuber known more for boxing matches and publicity stunts than political commentary, could recognize and call out sexist behavior, why hadn't any of the professional journalists in the room done the same? The answer, many concluded, was that the professionals had become too invested in the system to see its failures clearly. It took an outsider to point out that the emperor had no clothes. A year later, when the incident was still being discussed in media ethics courses and political science seminars, one detail stood out above all others. Jake Paul had never planned to become a political figure. He had simply seen something wrong and refused to ignore it. "I went on that show to talk about boxing," he said in a later interview. "I ended up talking about basic human decency because apparently that's controversial now. That should tell you everything you need to know about where we are as a society." The most remarkable thing about that night wasn't just that Jake Paul had defended Karoline Leavitt. It was that he had demonstrated something that had become rare in American discourse: the willingness to stand up for principles over politics, fairness over favoritism, and basic respect over tribal loyalty. In a political climate where everyone was expected to pick a side and stick to it no matter what, Jake Paul had chosen a different side entirely, the side of treating people like human beings. And in doing so, he had delivered a lesson in integrity that resonated far beyond the walls of the Ed Sullivan Theater. Years from now, when media historians write about the decline of traditional late-night television and the rise of independent voices, they'll point to many factors: the internet's disruption of traditional gatekeepers, the increasing polarization of American politics, the growing distrust of institutional media. But they'll also remember the night when a YouTube star walked onto Stephen Colbert's stage and reminded America what it looks like when someone refuses to let sexism and bullying masquerade as entertainment. The night when the most powerful person in the room turned out to be the one who wasn't supposed to be there at all. It was the night that Stephen Colbert tried to humiliate Karoline Leavitt with sexist attacks and personal insults. And Jake Paul shut down the entire show. Not with force, not with shouting, but with something far more powerful: the simple act of calling out injustice when he saw it, even when every professional in the room had chosen to look the other way. And that's a lesson worth remembering, no matter what side of the political aisle you call home. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to be silent when you witness something wrong. Sometimes being decent is the most radical act of all.